At Saqqara, on the desert edge west of the old capital at Memphis, there is a broken statue. The figure it once carried is gone, sheared off at the ankles, and only the base survives. It is a slab of hard stone, carved with the formal titles of a king named Djoser, who ruled in the Third Dynasty almost 5,000 years ago. The king is not the only name on the stone. Beside his, cut by the same hand into the same surface, is the name of a man who wore no crown. He is named there as the chancellor, the first after the king, the overseer of the great house, the builder, the carver, the maker of vessels of stone. For most of recorded history, scholars were not certain this man had ever lived at all, and the thing he is credited with building still stands a short walk from where that base was found, the oldest mountain of cut stone anywhere on Earth, raised under the direction of a commoner whose tomb no one has ever located. You already know the broad shape of the story. Pyramids belong to pharaohs, stone piled toward the sky to carry a dead king into the next world, the work of a civilization that built slowly, learned slowly, and refined its methods across long centuries. That is the version taught in most rooms, and most of it holds. The beginning of it is where the trouble starts, because the beginning does not behave the way a slow and gradual story should. Before this moment, Egyptians buried their dead under low rectangular mounds of mudbrick called mastabas, flat-topped and modest, little more than reinforced graves. Then, inside a single rain, something else rose from the sand at Saqqara. 6 great terraces of stone, stacked one upon the next, climbing more than 200 feet above the desert floor. Earlier walls had been mudbrick, sometimes given a thin shell of stone for show. This was different all the way through. Every block was cut stone, coursed and raised as stone, from the ground to the highest step. And the leap from the mudbrick mound to that step tower did not take 1,000 years of trial and error. It took one lifetime. A single name is tied to that lifetime, and it is not the king's. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The name is Imhotep, and we know it survived because of that broken base. In the 1920s, working the sand at the foot of the great stepped structure, the excavator Cecil Firth uncovered the fragment, and when the titles on it were read, one set of them did not belong to the king. They belonged to a second man, listed with a rank almost unheard of for anyone outside the royal family. Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, first after the King of Upper Egypt, High Priest at Heliopolis, the old center of the sun cult, builder, sculptor, maker of stone vessels. To have a commoner's name and offices carved beside the king's, on the king's own monument, was close to unthinkable in that age. Here it happened. There is a detail that is easy to miss now that his name is famous. For a long stretch of modern scholarship, serious people suspected Imhotep had never been real. The later Egyptians spoke of him constantly, but they spoke the way people speak of a legend, and the distance between his own era and the records that praised him ran to thousands of years. Without something contemporary, something carved while he lived or close to it, he could just as easily have been a story the priests built later to explain a monument too strange to explain any other way. The statue base is one of the few hard threads tying the legend back to a living man. Pull it away and Imhotep dissolves into myth. Leave it in place and he stands as perhaps the first individual genius whose name history actually kept. Begin with what he is said to have made, because the building itself is the strongest evidence that something unusual happened here. The stepped pyramid did not start as a pyramid. It started as one of those flat mastabas, a low square of stone. Then it was widened. Then it was raised, and raised again, each stage set smaller on the one beneath, until the flat tomb had become a mountain of 6 receding levels. Around it spread an enormous walled enclosure, courts and shrines and false buildings of solid stone, columns carved to imitate bundles of reeds and stalks of papyrus, an entire architecture writing its own rules as it went. None of it had a real precedent at that scale. The structural problems involved, how to course stone so it carries its own weight, how to keep a tall stepped mass from spreading and failing, how to dress and fit countless blocks so the whole thing holds, were being solved for what looks like the first time, and solved well enough that the result is still standing. A modern engineering team has spent years just trying to keep it from coming down. The man who first put it up had no model to copy and no one to ask. That is the strangeness the standard account asks you to walk past quickly. The nerve to attempt a thing no one had attempted, at a size no one had reached, appearing in one reign and attached to one name. Go beneath it and the strangeness deepens. Under the stepped mountain runs a shaft sunk roughly 100 feet straight down into the bedrock, opening at its foot into a sealed burial vault of granite hauled from the quarries at Aswan, far to the south. Around that central shaft spreads a labyrinth of tunnels and galleries cut into the rock, miles of them in total, storerooms and corridors and dead ends, some of them lined with thousands of small blue-green faience tiles, set to imitate the woven reed matting that had hung on the walls of a king's house in life. Whoever planned this was not only stacking stone in the sun, he was thinking in 3 dimensions, above the ground and below it at once, translating the soft materials of an older world, reed and timber and brick, into permanent stone meant to copy their shapes forever. In the enclosure above sits a small sealed box of a chamber called the serdab, and walled inside it is a life-size statue of the king himself, tilted slightly back, with 2 round holes bored through the stone at the level of its eyes, so the figure could keep watching the rituals performed for it. None of these were obvious solutions. Each one is an answer to a problem no one had ever been handed, the problem of making a building that had to last not for a lifetime, but for all of time. And the tradition is unanimous about whose mind shaped those answers. One man, working at the very edge of what stone could be made to do, and well past the edge of what anyone before him had tried. He was not remembered only as a builder. The tradition that gathered around Imhotep made him something far wider than that. He was held to be a physician, a healer with an understanding of the body, in an age when almost no one understood it. He was a priest and a watcher of the stars at Heliopolis, a keeper of the calendar. He was a vizier, the administrative mind running the kingdom beneath the king. By later centuries, scribes would tip out a single drop from their pens before they began to write, a small offering to Imhotep, as though no act of writing should start without him. That breadth is genuinely unusual. Most names that reach us from the ancient world reach us for one thing only: a king, a battle, a single deed. Imhotep comes down as architect, healer, priest, astronomer, and statesman at once, a single person credited with command of nearly every field his civilization prized. Part of that is surely the way legends pull every good thing toward one famous name over time, but the core of it, the building, is real and standing. And once a man has plainly done the impossible in stone, it gets harder to wave away the rest of what was said about him. Then comes the part with almost no parallel in Egyptian history. Imhotep was made a god. Egyptian kings were sometimes raised to divine status, and that was familiar enough. Imhotep was a commoner, born outside the royal line, and that made what happened to him, a man who held offices and built tombs and then died like anyone else, was lifted, roughly 2,000 years after his death, into the company of the gods. He became a deity of medicine and healing. The sick came to temples raised in his name and slept there through the night, hoping he would come to them in a dream and tell them how to be well. When the Greeks arrived and looked for an Egyptian god to set beside their own healer Asclepius, they chose Imhotep, and the two were folded into one. His cult outlasted the dynasty that produced him, outlasted dynasty after dynasty after that, and was still drawing pilgrims when Egypt itself had long passed under foreign rule. Measure that for a moment. An administrator from the first age of the kingdom became, across the slow turn of 2,000 years, a healing god that a whole civilization, and then the civilizations that followed it, knelt to. Almost no one else in the entire span of Egyptian memory crossed that line from man to god from below. He did. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. There is one more place where the hieroglyphs speak his name directly, and it deserves an honest word about what it is and what it is not. Far to the south, on a granite boulder on the island of Sahel near Aswan, an inscription tells of a 7-year famine in the reign of Djoser, the Nile failing to rise, the land going hungry, and the king turning to a wise advisor to learn the cause. That advisor is Imhotep. The text describes him searching the old records, consulting the sacred writings, and bringing the king the knowledge that ends the famine. It reads like a window opened straight onto his life. The honest part is this. That boulder was carved more than 2,000 years after Djoser and Imhotep were both dead, in the Ptolemaic age, by people looking back across an almost unimaginable gulf of time at a figure who had already become a god. It is not a contemporary report. It is a much later civilization writing down what it believed about a man it could no longer remember as a man. And that is exactly what makes it worth pausing on. Even thousands of years downstream, when nearly everything else about him had faded into nothing, the one thing his civilization still insisted on, still cut into solid granite, was that Imhotep was the mind you went to when the problem was impossible. The keeper of knowledge no one else held. The stories around him held that shape across the entire length of Egyptian history, which is a strange kind of consistency to find clinging to a man we can barely prove existed. So picture the full shape of it. A man whose name was carved beside a king's, who raised the first stone mountain on earth, who was remembered as healer and sage, who was turned into a god and worshipped for thousands of years, and no one has ever found his grave. That absence is the quiet center of everything. Egypt was a civilization built around burial, around preserving the body and marking the spot, and a figure of Imhotep's weight should have been laid to rest in a tomb fit to stand beside a king's. He almost certainly was. We simply cannot find it. In the 1960s, the archaeologist Walter Emery went looking for that tomb in earnest, out in the desert at North Saqqara, convinced the burial of Imhotep lay somewhere in that ground. He had a thread to pull. Pilgrims who came to honor Imhotep had left behind enormous numbers of mummified ibises near his cult site, the ibis being the bird of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing that Imhotep had come to be tied to. Emery cut into galleries packed with those birds, vast underground catacombs left by the faithful over centuries, the offerings of people who had walked out into that desert to remember him. He found the offerings. He found the whole apparatus of the cult that had surrounded the man. He never found the man. Year after year of patient digging turned up proof that crowds had come there to honor Imhotep, and never the place where Imhotep himself was laid. The tomb, if it survives, is still out there beneath the sand, unmarked and unentered. If it does not survive, then the grave of the first-named genius in human history is simply gone, and the only mountain we can point to that is truly his is the one he built for someone else. This is where the word in the title, erased, has to be handled with care, because it does not carry its usual meaning here. Imhotep was not chiseled out of the record the way some figures were, their names battered off the walls by the people who came after them out of hatred or fear. The opposite happened to him. He was remembered harder than almost anyone in his world. And yet, set against the size of that memory, the record of his actual life is astonishingly thin. A small handful of contemporary mentions, that broken statue base, a scatter of references, and then long silence before the legend swells to fill the sky. We do not have his words. His grave is missing. We barely have the man at all, only the god he became and the building he left behind. So the erasure here is not a name violently scrubbed from the stone, it is something quieter and far stranger. A real person built the first great work of stone and then dissolved so completely into legend that the person vanished inside it. The flesh and blood engineer who solved problems no one had solved became a divine abstraction, and both his beginning and his ending went dark. This is the point where my reading stops being anything the record can prove, and I want to be straight with you about that line. The documented part is all of what I have already set out. The building, the titles, the missing grave, the godhood, every piece of that is real, and you can go and read it for yourself. What comes next is the question, not the answer. Because there is a reading of all this that some of the people who sit longest with it cannot put down. The leap to monumental stone is too sudden. The man at the heart of it is too complete, gifted across too many fields, raised to a god too readily, and missing from his own grave too thoroughly. The theory goes that an absence this total, gathered around a knowledge this important, might not be pure accident. That the origin of how a civilization first learned to command stone, and the resting place of the single mind tied to that origin, both going dark together, could be a thing that was allowed to happen, or made to happen, rather than lost by chance to time. I am not going to dress that up as proven, because it is not. Lay the real pieces side by side, though, and you can see why the question will not close. At the very start of monumental building, in the place where people first stacked cut stone into a mountain, there is a discontinuity the slow and steady story does not fully cover. And standing inside that discontinuity is one man, named beside a king on a broken slab, credited with a leap that had no rehearsal anywhere, remembered as healer and sage, and at last as a god, and buried in a tomb that thousands of years of searching, including the determined modern hunt of a man who was sure he knew the rough ground, have never brought to light. The honest version of the title is that one, a living human being who built the first great work of stone and then dissolved so fully into legend that we cannot find where he was laid, cannot recover his life, and cannot fully account for where his skill came from. Whether that is the ordinary erosion of nearly 5,000 years, which swallows almost everything in the end, or whether it is the deliberate closing of a door, is precisely the thing no one can settle right now. This channel sits in that gap on purpose. The pieces are real, the reading is mine, the verdict is yours. The statue base rests in a museum now, behind glass, the king and the commoner sharing one slab of stone the way they once shared one age. The stepped pyramid still rises over Saqqara, repaired and braced, the oldest large stone building in the world, the seed of everything that came after it, every smooth-sided pyramid, and every great temple, traced back to the first man who dared to lift stone that high. His name lives in the history of medicine and the history of architecture. His god still has temples standing in ruin, and somewhere under the sand a short distance from the mountain he built, or else lost for good to the long grinding of time, lies the grave of Imhotep, the first engineer whose name survived, unmarked, unentered, and as of this moment unfound. We have the work he left, the legend that swallowed him, and the god he became. The man himself is missing, and the question of where they put him, and why a figure that large has no grave we can stand over, is one the stone has been holding for almost 5,000 years, and has not yet handed back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.